Women who were born without eyes after generations of incest in the Appalachia, the most cruel face of consanguinity. This dark story begins in 1923 in the heart of the mountains of Appalachia, in a remote region of Tennessee. It was a period when the mountains functioned as natural barriers, isolating entire communities from the rest of civilization. In these lands forgotten by time, where the law rarely arrived, a family became the epicenter of a genetic tragedy that would affect generations. Caldwell were known by local residents like the people of the shadows. Established in the mountains since the late 18th century, they occupied an isolated valley, far from the nearest urban centers. The family, led by patriarch Jedediah Caldwell, lived from subsistence agriculture and hunting, resisting fiercely any attempt to integrate with neighboring communities. Geographic insulation was only part of the problem. Caldwell cultivated a deep contempt for the outside world, fueled by old family stories about persecution and injustice. This self-imposed isolation created the perfect environment for a practice that would become its darkest legacy: marriage between close relatives. "Pure blood keeps the family strong," was the mantra repeated by Jedediah to her children and grandchildren. In fact, this mistaken belief was not uncommon at that time and region. Many communities isolated from Appalachia, by necessity or tradition, practiced marriages between cousins. But Caldwell took this practice to rarely documented extremes. In 1925, Marion Caldwell, daughter of Jedediah, gave birth to a girl named Eliza. The child's father was his own first cousin, Thomas Caldwell. The girl was born with a disturbing peculiarity. Where her eyes should be, there were only small, empty cavities, covered by a thin layer of skin. The midwife who helped childbirth, one of the few outsiders allowed on the property, was horrified. But for Caldwell, the child's condition was attributed to evil spirits or a divine curse. The news of the child born without an eye eventually hit the ears of Dr. William Forrester, a doctor from the nearest city. Intrigued and worried, he tried to visit the family to examine the child, but was received with shotguns pointed and threats. The doctor, however, did not give up easily. For the next 5 years, he carefully documented rumors and reports about the Caldwell that came to him. In his diary, found decades later by researchers, Dr. Forrester wrote, "I am increasingly convinced that Caldwell's condition is not the result of a curse, but of union between individuals of nearby blood ties. Science is already beginning to understand the dangers of such unions, although isolated communities remain ignorant of these facts." In 1931, another birth in the Caldwell family caught the eye. Martha Caldwell, Marion's cousin, gave birth to twins. One of the girls was born with the same condition as Eliza, completely eyeless. The other had eyes, but had other physical deformities, including cast fingers and severe spinal curvature. Dr. Forrester, upon learning of this new case, wrote to the Tennessee Health Department, warning about the possible public health crisis. His letter, preserved in the state archives, contains the first documented mention of what would later be known as the blindness of Caldwell. "We witness here the tragic result of isolation and ignorance," he wrote. "These children are victims not only of their physical conditions, but of family practices that perpetuate and amplify congenital defects through generations." The authorities' response was slow and inadequate. In 1932, a health officer was sent to investigate, but, like Dr. Forrester, was prevented from entering Caldwell's property. The official report concluded that, in the absence of direct evidence and considering respect for local traditions, no additional action would be taken. This was the first of many moments when the system failed with the children Caldwell. During the following decades, the family would continue their consanguineous marriages, isolated from public scrutiny, while the number of children born with severe genetic deformities grew quietly. In 1934, the Great Depression hardly reached the region. The few interactions Caldwell kept with the outside world, especially to sell fur and buy essential supplies, have become even rarer. The family turned even further, deepening their isolation and mutual dependence. It was in this context that Jedediah Caldwell, then 70, established a rule that would seal the fate of future generations. No family member would be allowed to marry outsiders. "The world out there is dying," he eclacted. "We will only survive, keeping our blood strong and pure." The Caldwell tragedy was not an isolated event in the history of the Appalachians. Other isolated communities have faced similar problems, though rarely so severe. What made the case of Caldwell particularly devastating was the combination of extreme geographical isolation, a family ideology that actively promoted consanguinity, and persistent neglect of public authorities. Check it out if it is already subscribed to this channel. Caldwell's story reveals an obscure side of American history that few people know, a dark secret hidden in the mountains that will forever change their vision of isolation and heredity. Subscribe now not to lose the next chapters of this exclusive investigation into the deepest secrets of the mountains of Appalachia. The 1940s brought significant changes to rural America, but the Caldwell Valley remained practically untouched by progress. While the rest of the country faced World War II and experienced profound social transformations, the family continued its cycle of consanguineous isolation and reproduction, increasingly distant from the eyes of society. In 1943, a crucial event altered the family's fate. A strong storm destroyed the only bridge that connected the Caldwell Valley to the outside world. Naturally isolated, Caldwell were now completely separated from civilization. For most family members, this was not a calamity but a blessing, exactly the kind of isolation Jedediah has always wanted. By this time, Eliza Caldwell, the first free child, was 18 years old. Despite her blindness, she had developed remarkable compensatory meanings. His hearing was so keen that he could identify each family member only by the sound of his steps. His hands, trained to replace his absent eyes, were able to read the Earth's texture, to predict climate change, a particularly valuable ability for a family of farmers. But Eliza carried another burden beyond her congenital blindness. As revealed in later testimonials, she had been chosen as a wife for her uncle, Joshua Caldwell, her father's younger brother. This arrangement, decided when she was still a child, was part of Jedediah's strategy to strengthen family lineage. Marriage would be consummated when it turned 18, a practice that, even at that time and in that isolated region, would be considered abominable by the widest society. It was Sarah Caldwell, Eliza's aunt, and one of the few people in the family that occasionally visited the city before the destruction of the bridge, who first began to question family practices. During her rare visits to the city, she had heard conversations about bad blood and genetic weakness caused by relatives. These ideas, even if understood in a rudimentary way, planted seeds of doubt in their mind. In the spring of 1943, when the preparations for Eliza's wedding began, Sarah confronted Jedediah. "You don't see that you are condemning more children to be born like Eliza?" she would have asked, according to later reports from younger members of the family. Jedediah, furious with the questioning of his authority, expelled Sarah from the family meeting. Determined to prevent marriage, Sarah made the unthinkable. She fled the valley, swimming through the river that now, without the bridge, represented a formidable barrier. Arriving in the soaked and exhausted city, she sought Dr. Forrester, who still had her interest in Caldwell's case even after more than a decade. The doctor, now an elderly man, but still motivated by his professional ethics, immediately contained the authorities. Unlike 1932, this time the answer was more decisive. America was at war, and the federal government was exercising unprecedented levels of authority on domestic affairs. A district prosecutor, accompanied by state police, organized an expedition to the Caldwell Valley. The intervention resulted in violent confrontation. Jedediah and 2 of his children were killed in a shooting with the authorities. The other family members, including Eliza, were removed from the valley and taken for medical and psychological evaluation. Caldwell's property was temporarily confiscated by the state, a pending investigation. The medical examination revealed the extent of the damage caused by generations of consanguinity. Of the 32 people taken from the valley, 14 had significant deformities. In addition to the well-known eyeless children, doctors have documented cases of severe intellectual disabilities, heart malformations, and a variety of skeletal conditions. A medical report of the time describes, "It is as if we were observing the results of a cruel experiment, on the effects of consanguine reproduction prolonged Guinea in humans. The Caldwell case quickly became a case study in eugenism, the now discredited science that advocated reproductive control to improve the human genetic pool. Unfortunately, the findings were often misunderstood and used to justify discriminatory policies against isolated rural communities. For Eliza and the other women Caldwell born without eyes, the intervention brought mixed results. On the one hand, they finally received adequate medical care and were protected from future forced consanguine unions. On the other hand, many of them were admitted to state institutions for disabled, where they often received dehumanizing treatment. Dr. Harold Jenkins, a University of Tennessee geneticist who studied the case in 1945, was the first to correctly identify the specific condition that afflicted Caldwell women: congenital bilateral anophthalmia, the complete absence of eyes at birth. In his study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, one of the first volumes of this publication, he wrote, "Extraordinarily high prevalence of bilateral anophthalmia among Caldwell family women strongly suggests the presence of an X-chromosome recessive gene, which has been amplified through generations of consanguineous unions. In normal populations, the condition occurs in approximately 1 in 100,000 births. Among Caldwell, the rate is approximately 1 in 3 female births, an alarming frequency that demonstrates vividly the dangers of prolonged consanguinity." Dr. Jenkins's study was revolutionary at the time, establishing one of the first documented scientific connections between prolonged consanguinity and the dramatic increase in the expression of deleterious recessive genes. Their findings would be cited in the following decades in discussions on public policies related to relatives. Meanwhile, the life of women Caldwell continued. Eliza, who had never left the valley before, faced immense challenges of adaptation. Without the family milestones for whom she sailed in her Christmas environment, and without the social skills needed to interact with strangers, she initially entered a state of deep depression. He was a nurse named Margaret Wilson, who finally managed to establish a connection with Eliza. Through months of patient work, Margaret taught Eliza to read Braille and use a cane to get around. Gradually, Eliza began to develop a new identity, separated from the oppressive traditions of her family. In 1947, Eliza gave a detailed testimony about life in the Caldwell Valley. This testimonial, preserved in the state archives, offers one of the few windows for the internal life of this isolated family. She described how, since she was a child, she was prepared for her role as preserving lineage, and how children born with deformities were seen simultaneously as cursed and special, marked by God for a specific purpose within the family community. The 1950s marked the beginning of a new era in the scientific understanding of human genetics, and consequently, in the interpretation of the Caldwell case. The discovery of the DNA structure by Watson and Crick in 1953 revolutionized genetics, allowing scientists to start unraveling the molecular mechanisms behind hereditary conditions such as Caldwell women's anophthalmia. Dr. Richard Harron, a geneticist at Harvard University, revisited the case in 1956 using the new theoretical tools available. His studies on medical records and Caldwell genealogical trees allowed a more precise mapping of the condition's inheritance pattern. In his seminal article, Inheritance Standards in Genetic Isolates, the Caldwell Case, he wrote, "Caldwell genealogy analysis reveals a classic X-linked recessive inheritance pattern. Men with their only X chromosome serve as bearers when affected, but do not manifest the condition. Women with 2 X chromosomes manifest the condition only when they inherit the mutant gene of both parents. In exogamous populations, with marriages outside the family group, such coincidence would be extremely rare. However, after generations of consanguinity, the frequency of the mutant allele in Caldwell's genetic pool reached alarming levels, resulting in the high incidence of bilateral anophthalmia among family women." Dr. Harmon's work helped partially discuss the condition of women Caldwell, moving the narrative of the dominance of superstition and moral judgment to the field of objective science. However, women themselves continued to face prejudice and social isolation. In 1957, a journalist named Eleanor Patterson located Eliza Caldwell, then 32, living in a small house in Knoxville, Tennessee. Eliza had been one of the few Caldwell survivors being able to transition to an independent life after years of institutionalization. With the help of charity organizations and some compassionate citizens, she had learned to weave baskets, a skill that allowed her to gain modest income. The interview that Eleanor led with Eliza, published in Life magazine under the title "The Woman Without Eyes, a Survivor of the Mountains," brought national attention to the Caldwell case. For the first time, the American audience had access to a first-person narrative about the effects of extreme consanguinity. "Many people think I was born in darkness," Eliza was quoted saying, "but I had my own form of light. I knew every sound, every smell, every curve of the valley. It was my world. What truly plunged me into darkness was finding the truth about my family, which we were not special or chosen, as we were told, but victims of ignorance and isolation." The report included impactful photographs of Eliza, showing her profile face, with the empty eye orbits delicately covered by permanently closed eyelids. The images shocked middle-class America of the 1950s, causing discussions about rural health, geographical isolation, and the dangers of endogamy. It was after this report that several of the surviving Caldwell women began to meet, forming an informal support group. Martha Caldwell, one of the twins born in 1931, emerged as the leader of this group. Unlike his sister, who had died as a young man due to heart complications related to the multiple genetic conditions, Martha had survived and developed considerable resilience. Martha, using a recorder donated by a local church, began to collect the testimonies of the survivors. These recordings, later donated to the Tennessee Historical Archive, constitute an invaluable resource for understanding life within the isolated community of Caldwell. In one of the most disturbing recordings, Ruth Caldwell, born in 1939, also without eyes, describes what it was like to be prepared from childhood to marry her uncle. "They told us that we were special vases, chosen to carry the pure blood of the family. Our blindness was seen as a sign that we belonged only to the family, that we should never look to the outside world. We believed it. How could we not believe it? It was all we knew." Have you ever wondered what it would be like to grow in complete isolation, believing that your genetic condition was a blessing and not a curse? Leave in the comments "Isolation kills" if you believe that access to education and health could have avoided this tragedy. The recordings also reveal how the Caldwell family had developed its own mythology to explain and justify their practices. Eyes-born women were called inner seers, allegedly capable of perceiving spiritual truths inaccessible to those with physical vision. This mystical interpretation of his condition served to raise his status within the family, even while preparing them for a life of reproductive submission. During the 1960s, the Caldwell case began to attract the attention of anthropologists and sociologists interested in the dynamics of isolated communities. Dr. Thomas Bennett of the University of Chicago spent 3 years studying the case records and interviewing the survivors. His 1968 book, The Inhabitants of the Valley, Isolation, Consanguinity, and Culture in Appalachia, became a seminal work in the countryside. Bennett argued that the Caldwell case should not be seen simply as an aberration or as a result of superstition and ignorance, but as the extreme product of social, economic, and geographical forces that shaped many Appalachia's communities. Caldwell represent an extreme but not unique case. Through the Appalachia, geographical isolation, poverty, and the historical distrust of external authorities have created conditions for the development of endogamic communities. When we combine these factors with the lack of access to education and healthcare, we create the fertile ground for tragedies such as Caldwell. Bennett's work was revolutionary in contextualizing the case within a broader sociological analysis rather than treating it as a medical curiosity or a sensationalist narrative about rural degeneration, the approach that had dominated previous discussions. In 1965, an unexpected tragedy brought the Caldwell case again to public attention. Eliza Caldwell, then 40, was found dead in her apartment in Knoxville. The investigation concluded that she had committed suicide, leaving a brief note that she said only, "I got tired of being an example, a study case, a lesson. I just want to be remembered as a woman." His death caused a re-evaluation of the way Caldwell survivors had been treated by the medical system and the media. Many began to question whether the constant exposure and clinical analysis of their lives was not a form of exploitation that perpetuated their suffering in another format. The 1970s brought important advances in the scientific understanding of the Caldwell case in parallel to significant changes in survivors' lives. With the development of more sophisticated techniques of genetic analysis, researchers at Johns Hopkins University were able to identify for the first time the specific mutation responsible for the anophthalmia of women Caldwell. Dr. Michael Stern, study leader's leader, published his findings in 1973 in the prestigious Journal of Medical Genetics. His research identified a mutation in the SOX3 gene, located on the X chromosome, as the likely cause of the condition. This discovery was revolutionary, representing one of the first cases in which a complex human genetic condition was tracked to a specific mutation. Caldwell mutation, as we are calling it, offers an unprecedented glimpse of the molecular mechanisms of human eye development, Dr. Stern wrote. The fact that this mutation is rarely observed in general populations, but has reached high frequency in the Caldwell family, serves as a powerful example of the effects of the founding effect amplified for generations of consanguineous marriages. The founding effect, to which Dr. Stern referred to, is a genetic principle by which the loss of genetic variation occurs when a new population is established by a very small number of individuals, as was the case when Jedediah Caldwell and his original family isolated in the mountains. When combined with repeated consanguine marriages, this effect can lead to the high expression of rare genetic traits, exactly what happened to anophthalmia among Caldwell women. While science advanced in the technical understanding of the case, Caldwell survivors continued their personal journeys. Martha Caldwell, who had emerged as the group's informal spokesman, was invited in 1974 to speak of a rural health conference in Washington, D.C. Its presentation, entitled "Beyond Darkness, the Experienced Experience of Consanguinity," was the first time one of Caldwell women was able to go directly to the medical and political community. In his speech, preserved in audio in the conference archives, Martha challenged the predominant narrative. "You have studied us as specimens, catalogued our deformities, mapped our genes, but rarely asked what it is like to live in our bodies, our minds. We are not just examples of defective genetics. We are women with hope, fears, and dreams. And yes, we are survivors not only of our biology, but of a system of beliefs that valued purity above health and well-being." Martha's discourse had a significant impact, inspiring a new, more humanistic approach to the study of communities affected by genetic conditions. She was later invited to contribute to the development of educational materials about the risks of consanguinity intended for isolated rural communities. In 1976, a surprising discovery added another layer to the history of Caldwell. During a survey of the archives of a local church, historian Robert Williams found parish records dating from 1798 that documented the arrival of Ezekiel Caldwell, the father of Jedediah, to the region. The records revealed that Ezekiel had ran away from his Christmas county in North Carolina after being accused of nature practices, an euphemism commonly used for incestuous relationships. This discovery suggested that Caldwell's consanguineous practices preceded their isolation in the mountains of Appalachia, reversing the previous causal understanding. It was not simply the isolation that led to consanguinity, but possibly the reverse. The family sought isolation to continue practices that were already considered taboo, even in the most permissive standards of the late 18th century. Historian Williams argued in his book, Buried Roots: The True Origin of Caldwell Tragedy, that this broader historical context was crucial to completely understanding the case. Caldwell were not simply victims of geographical circumstances and ignorance, as they were often portrayed. Their history begins with a deliberate choice of isolation to escape social scrutiny, followed by building a system of beliefs that justified and sacramented practices that they knew to be condemned by the wider society. This is not a simple history of environmental determinism, but of complex interactions between choice, circumstance, and consequence through generations. This historical reassessment caused intense debates between academics and public commentators. Some criticized Williams for reducing socioeconomic and geographical factors that shaped the Caldwell community, while others praised their approach to restore the family's historic agency rather than simply portraying them as passive victims of their environment. In 1978, a documentary produced by PBS entitled In the Shadows of the Mountains Caldwell History brought the case to an even larger national audience. The documentary included interviews with Martha and other survivors, as well as with doctors, geneticists, and historians who had studied the case over the decades. One of the most striking scenes of the documentary showed Martha Caldwell returning to the valley where he grew up, now abandoned and partially claimed by the forest. Walking with the help of a cane, she sailed through the ground with surprising ease, resorting to tactile and auditory memories of her childhood. "Here," she said, stopping at a specific point, "it was where we were at night to hear the stories of his grandfather Jedediah about our ancestors. He told us that we were special, chosen to preserve something precious that the outside world would never understand. As children, we believed it was a privilege. Only later we understood it was a prison." The documentary won an Emmy and generated a renewed public interest in the case. This interest coincided with broader debates on reproductive rights, consent, and the limits of government intervention in cultural and family practices, topics that dominated the American public discourse of the 1970s. For survivors Caldwell, now middle-aged women, this renewed attention brought opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, several of them received offers from advanced medical treatments, including cosmetic eye prostheses that could improve their physical appearance, even if they did not restore their vision. On the other hand, many expressed fatigue with the continuous public and scientific scrutiny of their lives. Ruth Caldwell, in an interview rarely granted to Time magazine in 1979, expressed this ambivalence. "We spent our lives being studied, analyzed, discussed. Our bodies were treated as texts to be read by science, our stories as warnings to be told. I do not deny the importance of what medicine has learned to us, nor the value of alerting other communities about the dangers of consanguinity." The early 1980s marked a new phase in the history of women Caldwell, characterized by reconciliation efforts with their past and the search for a more positive legacy. Martha Caldwell, then 49, established the Caldwell Foundation for Genetic Awareness in 1982, a non-profit organization dedicated to educating isolated rural communities about the risks of consanguinity. The foundation, modest in its resources but ambitious in its objectives, produced educational materials in simple language, accessible to low-literacy communities. Using clear illustrations and direct explanations of basic genetics, the Foundation's pamphlets and booklets were distributed by isolated regions of Appalachia, often with the help of community health workers and local religious leaders. "We are not here to judge or condemn traditions," Martha often explained in her presentations to rural communities. "We are here to share information that was not available to our family, the knowledge that could have avoided so much suffering." The effectiveness of these educational efforts is difficult to quantify, but anecdotal reports suggest that they contributed to a reduction in the incidence of marriages among close relatives in several isolated communities. The Foundation's work also helped destinize the discussion about consanguinity, transforming it from a shameful taboo into a public health topic that could be openly approached. In 1983, Martha was invited to witness to a subcommittee of the Congress on Rural Health. His eloquent testimony about the long-term consequences of geographical isolation and lack of access to health and education services was instrumental in allocating federal funds for medical extension programs in remote regions of Appalachia. "The mountains that isolated us are not only geographical, but also economic and social," she told the legislators. "To break the isolation cycle that leads to practices like those that destroyed my family, we need to build bridges, not just physical, but bridges of knowledge, care, and understanding. While Martha was dedicated to public activism, other Caldwell survivors chose different ways. Ruth Caldwell, who had expressed discomfort with public attention, found purpose in working with blind children. Using her own vision, free navigation experience, she became a respected instructor at a blind school in Nashville, where she taught generations of children how to develop their tactile and hearing perceptions. In an interview with a local newspaper in 1984, Ruth reflected on her journey. "For a long time I thought of my condition just as a curse, a burden that carried due to the mistakes of my ancestors. But through my work with these children, I began to see my experience as a source of unique wisdom. I can teach a place of genuine understanding that other instructors, even the most dedicated, just don't have." In 1985, a significant event brought Caldwell survivors again to national attention. Dr. James Harrison, a neurologist specializing in sensory perception, published a revolutionary study on extraordinary hearing and tactile abilities developed by women Caldwell without eyes. His study, published in the journal Nature, documented how these women had developed areas of the cerebral cortex typically dedicated to visual processing to amplify other senses. Martha, Ruth's brain scan, and 3 other Caldwell survivors revealed patterns of neural activity that challenged earlier understandings about brain plasticity and sensory adaptation. Dr. Harrison concluded that Caldwell women had effectively redesigned their brains in response to their congenital condition, developing sensory abilities that rivaled or exceeded those documented in individuals who lost vision later in life. The Caldwell brain, as it was informally called in the subsequent scientific literature, has become an important case of study in neuroplasticity. What began as a genetic tragedy had inadvertently created a natural laboratory for the study of human brain adaptation. Always pragmatic, Martha commented on these findings in an interview with Scientific American magazine. "It is a comfort to know that something useful for science has come from our pain. But let us not be mistaken. No scientific discovery is worth the price our family paid. If you could choose, you would exchange all this scientific knowledge for a normal childhood for each of us." In 1987, an unexpected development added another layer to the already complex history of Caldwell. A woman named Rebecca Miller, 25, contacted the Caldwell Foundation claiming to be a descendant of Sarah Caldwell, Eliza's aunt who had warned the authorities about family practices in 1943. According to Rebecca, his grandmother Sarah had left Tennessee after the incident, settling in the West where she changed her name and rarely talked about her past. Only on his deathbed in 1986, Sarah had revealed her true identity to the family and handed over to Rebecca a diary kept during her years with the Caldwell. Sarah's diary, subsequently donated to Tennessee's Historical Archive, offered an extraordinary window to everyday life in the Caldwell isolated community during the 1920s and 1930s. Written in a meticulous handwriting, the diary not only the family's consanguineous practices, but also the complex belief system that supported them. Sarah described how Jedediah Caldwell had developed an idiosyncratic theology that mixed elements of fundamentalist Christianity with the folkloric traditions of the Appalachians and their own mystical interpretations. This theology positioned Caldwell as a chosen lineage, whose blood should remain not diluted by the outside world. Particularly disturbing was Sarah's account of how eyes born without eyes were treated. Far from being hidden or neglected, they were celebrated as special seers, allegedly capable of perceiving spiritual truths inaccessible to normal people. This veneration, however, coexisted with its exploration as perpetuators of the sacred lineage, euphemism for its role as reproductive in arranged consanguineous unions. The diary also revealed that Sarah had tried several times before 1943, warned authorities about the situation, but was ignored or not taken seriously. Only when Eliza's situation became imminent, her forced marriage to her uncle was scheduled to take place in a week, Sarah made her desperate escape. The publication, edited from the diary in 1988 under the title Witness in the Valley, Sarah Caldwell's Diary, became a national bestseller, inspiring renewed discussions on cultural isolation, patriarchal authority, and the role of women in closed communities. The book also provoked debates about the authorities' responsibility to intervene in harmful cultural practices, even when they occur in isolated communities that immediately resist external interference. For Martha and the other Caldwell survivors, Sarah's diary offered late validation. For decades, we struggled for people to believe in the extent and systematic nature of what happened in our voucher, Martha commented when the book was released. Sarah's diary confirms what we always knew, but also reveals the sooner our tragedy could have been interrupted if anyone had listened. In the late 1980s, the Caldwell case had passed the obscurity to become part of the case studies canon in medical genetics, neuroscience, and cultural anthropology. The survivors, now elderly women, had found several ways to reconcile with their past and build significant lives despite their traumatic experiences. Martha Caldwell continued her work with the foundation until her death in 1991 at 60. On their funeral, they attended not only the remaining few survivors, but also dozens of medical professionals, researchers, and activists whose careers and perspectives had been deeply influenced by their work and testimony. Martha's obituary at the New York Times described her as a woman who turned a dark inheritance into an illumination mission. The text continued, "Born without eyes due to generations of consanguineous marriages, Martha Caldwell dedicated his life to ensuring that other communities did not repeat the mistakes that devastated his family. His legacy lives not only in the field of medical genetics, where the Caldwell case remains a seminal study, but in the numerous families that, thanks to their educational efforts, were spared of similar suffering." Ruth Caldwell continued her work with blind children until her retirement in 1994, receiving multiple recognitions for her pioneering contributions to sensory teaching techniques. She died in 1998 at the age of 59, leaving a legacy of pedagogical innovation that continues to influence the education of children with visual impairment. The scientific discoveries related to the Caldwell case continued in the following decades. In 1995, researchers at the University of Michigan accurately identified the specific genetic mutation responsible for the anophthalmia of women Caldwell, a SOX3 gene deletion that affects early eye development. This finding contributed significantly to the understanding of the embryonic development of human eyes. In 2002, a comprehensive study published by the geneticist Dr. Lawrence Klein analyzed the DNA of more than 200 indirect descendants of Caldwell spread throughout the United States. The study revealed that approximately 1 out of 40 residents of certain regions of the Appalachias carries the Caldwell mutation in recessive form, a silent testimony of the dispersion of family genes through the following generations. The Caldwell case remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation, scientific ignorance, and the harmful traditions perpetuated in the name of purity or preservation. But it is also a history of extraordinary human resilience, adaptation, and the ability to transform personal suffering into social advancement. Women who were born without eyes in the Appalachias, victims of generations of consanguinity, eventually found ways to see beyond the limitations imposed by their genetics and culture. Through their testimonies, activism, and simply through their lives lived with dignity, they illuminated dark corners of human experience and contributed to a more informed and compassionate world. If you watched so far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. If you are not yet inscribed, this is the perfect time to join our community and discover more amazing and impactful stories like this. Your inscription helps us continue bringing these powerful narratives that reveal the darkest secrets of human experience. Don't forget to leave your like and share with friends who also enjoy real and impactful stories. The mountains keep many other secrets, and we will be here to reveal them to you, one chapter at a time.